Hi everyone, in this video we're doing two things. One, we're going through the general etiquette to follow when you're trying to contribute to open source. I've made a few videos now and the feedback that I've gotten from the maintainers is that a lot of pull requests are slightly aggressive or they're close worthy. So in this video, I wanted to talk about the etiquette to follow when contributing. And secondly, I went through the code base of Zerodha, basically the parts that they've open sourced. A lot of them are in Python and Golang, things that I don't have a lot of experience in. And I wanted to share my journey of trying to understand the code base, trying to contribute, figuring out what are the right places I should contribute to, and being very polite when I'm trying to contribute. In the end, I was sort of able to find something, but since I'm not very experienced in Golang, I did not directly contribute. I left a comment for the maintainers and the person who was working on that pull request to respond to me so that I can learn rather than contributing just yet when there are smarter people that can contribute. And more importantly, what I want to take from the code base is not a lot of open source contributions, but learning how I can get better at understanding production grade Golang code versus trying to scramble through contribution numbers as soon as possible. So these two things are going to be the gist of the video. I have timestamps linked in the description, so feel free to skip through it. With that, let's get right into the video. So I want to start with a story for the first part. Let's say you had a very long marathon that you had to run for the next 30 years. So you basically have to cover, let's say 20 miles in 30 years, which seems humble, but okay. Would you start running immediately or would you first, I don't know, get in better shape for like 2 to 3 years and then start running? I think you guys know where I'm going with this. When you're trying to contribute to open source, it might feel like you're missing out on an opportunity if you don't contribute as soon as possible. But the thing is, the road is very long and the race is very long, and most probably, if you're scrambling to get through issues, you won't get hired if that's your final goal. I have been a victim of this myself. My very first open source contribution was me trying to scramble to get through Google Summer of Code. And then right after I made the contribution, I sort of knew I won't make it in because it was a very ugly contribution. The goal initially should be to learn. And the way to learn by going through an open source project is to understand why they took the choices they did. Also being very sure this is the tech stack that you want to work with, or this is the tech stack you want to understand right now. A lot of times, step 0 is not contributing. Step 0 is, well, setting up the project and then going through it and then understanding some parts, then maybe solving some documentation issues and then diving into the project, versus picking two types of issues. You should never pick two types of issues. One, that you don't understand are very big and are created by the maintainers, and two, the issues that you've created in your head. If you're a beginner, please don't create an issue yourself and start contributing to it. Like, the maintainers have created issues, people have created issues. They'll prioritize it and then sort of people work on it. If you create an issue yourself, it may not be an issue in the head of the maintainer, and it's very difficult to sort of go through spammy issues. A lot of my motivation for explaining this was I've talked to a bunch of companies that I've sort of contributed to, and the general feedback has been a lot of pull requests that come are close worthy. And by close worthy, I mean they don't really feel like they're worthy of getting merged in. And I think the reason for that is, like, a lot of people quickly want to get hired or like quickly want to contribute as much as possible, but that's not the right way to go about it. You need to sharpen your axe first. Programming is something that's sort of a very good career, but over the long term, make sure you're giving it due time to understand and clear your fundamentals. You can always contribute to projects. There are too many projects out there and there are too many job opportunities, but only for people who are really good, who understand their fundamentals correctly. So what are the things to keep in mind? A lot of this will come practically because I did not know the Zerodha code base. I don't understand Golang very well. And you'll see very soon when I was going through that code base, how I navigated through it and how I was humble and polite in trying to understand the issues. I did not rush to solve any issue. In fact, by the end of it, I haven't solved anything yet. I've just left a comment which may or may not lead to me working on a bigger project. But I did not create a pull request on day 0. You don't have to be very aggressive when it comes to creating pull requests. One good PR is all you need, and usually one good PR is sort of necessary for you to get in, and you'll only be able to create one good big pull request if you understand the code very well. For that, you need to clear your fundamentals. If this is like a full stack project you're contributing to, you need to know full stack development very well. If this is a DevOps project, you need to understand DevOps. Only then can you contribute. You can create a few random pull requests that they may or may not need, but you won't get hired like that. And more importantly, you won't learn anything. So short and sweet advice, please don't spam projects, especially the projects that I'm sort of introducing in these videos. It puts me in a very bad position when I talk to the maintainers of these projects. So only contribute if you understand it. If you want to practice, create a fork and practice on it as much as you want. but only contribute if you understand the code base very well. Again, the race is very long and there are a lot of projects. One contribution here, one contribution there won't get you anywhere. You need to clear your fundamentals and then you'll sort of get a job. Could be through open source contributions, could be through a normal recruiting process, as long as you're good, as long as your skills are good. So focus on the skills. Contributions will come and go and projects will always be there. First, make sure you're very strong at software development. Open source contributions can come. If you're good, feel free to contribute. If not, learn. And I'm going to show you exactly how I learned the Zerodha code base, the parts that they've open sourced, and sort of think I'm in a position to contribute, but I've left it at them whether or not they want me to contribute. Cool. With that, let's get to the second part and let me show you how I went through their open source code base. Generally, how Zerodha hired, from what I could understand, their general tech stack, and what are the sort of final contributions that I found and sort of comments that I've made. That may or may not lead to a contribution. Let's get into the second part. Okay, so the first step was just searching for Zerodha's GitHub. They have a mildly active GitHub. I think most of their projects are closed source. I think rightfully so. If you're building something like Zerodha, it's like involves financial transactions, you want to keep certain part of your code base closed source. But the things that are open source are basically Python, JavaScript, Java, Golang SDKs to connect to their API. So if you want to create a front end of your own that in the backend sort of talks to Zerodha APIs, they've created SDKs for it. And these are fairly inactive because, well, you just have to create them once. So the last pull request here was on Jan 9th. The last one here was on March 31st. And they don't have a lot of issues either. So it was sort of obvious to me that they don't open source most of their things. Only the SDKs they've open sourced, which sort of makes sense. There's no real point to closed sourcing SDKs, which people are anyways going to use. So they've open sourced a bunch of things. Not a lot of issues in all of these to solve, but I basically went through their most starred repo, which is PyKiteConnect and the KiteConnect.js. This one only had 3 issues and the last issue was made in 2022. So it's a fairly stale repo. Not saying it's not used as often, maybe it is used, but like it does not require a lot of changes on a day-to-day basis. Plus it's in Python, which I'm like mildly experienced in, not too much. So I sort of closed this and I went to KiteConnect.js, which is their JavaScript SDK. What does it do? It lets anyone, like if you've heard of small cases, they sort of use the APIs of Zerodha for placing orders on your behalf. You can select a basket of stocks that you want to buy, for example, tech stocks, and then it will create an order for you on Zerodha. For that, they sort of need your authentication token, basically some sort of permission from you to place orders on Zerodha. And also need to connect to Zerodha, send a bunch of HTTP calls. The SDK sort of wraps those HTTP calls into some very nice functions. That's usually what an SDK does. Most such API projects will expose SDKs in various languages. This is their JavaScript SDK. Last merge was on 31st March, so still fairly inactive. I went through their issues section. I saw support for TypeScript. So this felt like a good issue to solve. This was fairly old, 2021. And this has sort of mildly been solved already. When I went through it, I saw there was one pull request that was merged. So I refactored the lib to TypeScript and changed some config on testing files. So that has already been merged. Would have been a good issue to pick, I think. The other issue I saw was expose on message function. This was created in 2022. Felt like a fairly simple thing. What it says is, in the Python client, we have the on message function, which exposes the binary data. Can we add a similar on message trigger that triggers callback method for the binary data? So when you're connecting to the SDK, especially if you want real-time, let's say, trade updates, who traded, what got traded, and like where the chart went, a lot of times the data that you will receive from Kite or like Zerodha's backend servers would be binary data. Again, this is all speculation in my head. Maybe this means something else. But the user said, whenever binary data is received, which I'm assuming is like real-time trade data, you want to call a callback, an on-message callback, very similar to what's happening here in ticker.py. As you can see, it says triggered when message received from the server, and the payload is the raw body received from the server. Python already has it. This is the PyKiteConnect project. And the user said it makes sense to expose something similar in JavaScript. So I went through their code. If you look at lib, there's a very similar ticker.js file here, ticker.ts, similar to the ticker.py file here. And I sort of started searching for on_message, did not find it. Then I started to go through the code and I found, let me close this, and I found the basically whenever your backend server sends you data in real time is when you want to call this callback. So ws.onMessage, which is basically when your WebSocket received a message from the backend server. As you can see, I saw a comment here and then sort of knew this might have already been done. Whenever you get binary tick data basically means like real-time data, you trigger message, which is sort of what the user wanted in this issue, I think. So you also like sort of trigger another callback, the ticks callback with the exact parsed data, but you're already sending the binary data to this message callback. So I think what the user wants in this issue is already done. Could be wrong. The issue is still open, so maybe it's not done, but from what I could get, we're already sort of sending data back to the client using the message callback. So trigger message e.data will sort of, whoever is calling this SDK, whoever sort of calls the this.connect function, or basically the kite SDK or like kite ticker.on function, will sort of be able to receive binary data, which is what the user wanted. So this issue, I feel, is already done. So that's where I left the repo. Also, as I said, there's not a lot of activity here. There's like, for example, nikhilkamath.me. There's, for example, nithinkamath.me, which I'm assuming is their sort of CEO's blog or something. Yeah. Which also, please don't contribute to. It's like their personal blog. And hence, the bottom line was, they've not open sourced many things. The parts that they have open sourced, they sort of don't require active contributions. So this was like a decent stop for me. But then I saw this zerodha.tech/projects, and I saw there's a project at the very top. I did not see this project on their own GitHub, because this is sort of hosted on the GitHub of the CTO of Zerodha. So it's probably a personal project. I think this is used very heavily in Zerodha. This is what sends out emails in Zerodha. I could be wrong. And hence this is like a project that is used inside Zerodha, only it's not hosted in the Zerodha repo, because it's a personal project of the CTO of the company. And this seems like a fairly active project. A lot of contributions here. What the project does, it also has like 45 issues. What the project does is it sort of lets you create, as it says, a standalone self-hosted newsletter and mailing list manager. So in Zerodha, whenever you create a trade or like there are settlements that happen at the end of the day, you need to send down emails to the end user, letting them know their balances and the trades that they made, so on and so forth. Maybe even promotional emails that you have to send from time to time. And this is what they use, from what I could understand, to send emails to millions of users. And hence it's like a very nice, important, scalable project used very effectively inside Zerodha. Might not be directly related to the business, but it's like used very actively, and if it goes down, sort of it'll create problems for the business. So it's like a decent project that affects the business very well. So it's a decent project to contribute it to. Again, one thing you should know about Zerodha is they don't hire very often. They have a very small tech team, and hence, again, repeating, don't contribute to get a job. Don't contribute if you understand the code base very well. And as you'll see right now, since this is the first time I'm looking at it and the backend is in Golang, I was fairly humble in trying to understand the issues, did not solve anything on day zero, and asked people around, hey, should I contribute this way? This is the right way to go. And then went from there. So now let's try to understand what this thing does, how you can set it up locally, and how I sort of targeted the issues here. So as I said, it's like a newsletter manager. So you can sort of put in emails and create campaigns and send out emails. You might have received promotional emails, let's say from Zerodha or like other companies. It's like a way for you to track all the emails at one place and broadcast emails to end users. So the way to run it, it's like one command you have to run, and it'll run like a demo version for you to fiddle with. And then there's this production version. You can also like set it up completely locally. I'm not doing that yet. I tried these two yesterday and was able to set it up locally. Fairly simple. All small boy stuff here. So I won't be going through the setup procedure. I'll take you through the issues that I found. The one specific issue that sort of intrigued me, and how I thought of contributing to it, and how I'm sort of thinking and asking whether or not I should contribute, not making a direct contribution right now. So there are a bunch of issues. A lot of these are like sort of old. This one also like seems like a fairly stable repo, so there's not a lot of activity. The one that I saw, there were a few that I saw, frankly. Dynamic custom email headers. So this sort of required knowledge of SMTP, and there are a bunch of issues here that do require that, which is something I don't know, and at this moment, not really something I want to learn, and hence I did not solve these issues. The other sort of issues I saw were better installation documents, like documentation issues, which are good for you to start off with, but like usually not good if you want to like sort of actually understand the underlying project. So I did not claim this issue either. There were a few sort of bugs which I think might be good things for you to solve. For example, analytics not displaying. This one would require a lot of investigation, and hence again not something I did. Edit subscribers via API. This also felt like a decent issue to solve, but feels like it's already solved. Did not spend too much time on it, very frankly. And finally, this is the issue that I sort of saw, which says redundant data field in API spec collections.yaml. So a few reasons why I picked this issue. I've sort of been trying to understand the OpenAPI spec myself. For those of you who don't know, it's basically when you create HTTP servers, right? You have a bunch of routes, you have a bunch of responses that those routes will return, and they expect sort of some header, some body, so on and so forth. And you can create like a spec, which is basically one very long file, which contains all of your routes, what inputs they expect, what outputs they sort of give, and what status codes you can expect from it. It's called the OpenAPI spec. You can read more about it. And it's good because once you have this file, you can, one, create like a web page where you can simply hit these HTTP endpoints. So you don't have to create like a complete website. You will have to eventually for your end users. But for testing purposes, you can very easily get like what's called a Swagger page. A UI similar to this. So this is like a test project I'm assuming they've created for a pet store. And this is the Swagger sort of page for it. So just with one very long OpenAPI file, they were able to create this page. And on this page, I can simply put the pet ID, additional metadata, whatever, and hit these endpoints and sort of get back a response. And it'll do validations for me. Basically, a very nice way for the app developer to test all of their routes. And more importantly, you can sort of create Java clients or Node.js clients or Python clients, which are basically very nice libraries, basically something similar to the thing that we were seeing before this. If you go to the code base of Zerodha, the PyKite Connect, the Kite Connect JS, the Java Kite Connect are all libraries or SDKs that in the end either hit some HTTP endpoints or connect to a WebSocket server of Zerodha. What if the person who sort of created the HTTP server also created an OpenAPI spec file? Then they wouldn't have to write all of these individually, these SDKs. They'll sort of be auto-generated because in the end, these are all clients. And by client, I mean these are basically functions in these languages that you can call versus actually calling like a fetch call or making an actual HTTP call under the hood. You can just call some functions. That's sort of what a client means. That's sort of the SDKs they've built here. Only they have like some more things. They make a WebSocket connection along with HTTP calls. So if this is the Zerodha backend server and it has, let's say, an HTTP server running, it has a bunch of routes. For example, get to get trade data and post to put an order. What if you could auto generate this file that will let you test the API endpoints directly here, so you don't have to create like the Zerodha website where people can create orders. Theoretically, people or developers at least could just use this to create orders or fetch order data, so on and so forth. But even if you have to either create your own website, for example, Zerodha.com, or if you want to allow other users to sort of build on top of the Zerodha API, you will have to expose SDKs, which they've done here, but they've written it manually. What if you could automate the process of creating them? That's exactly what sort of OpenAPI spec lets you do. You just have to create one very long file where you describe your routes. Once you do, you can auto-generate a Java client, a Go client, a JS client, so on and so forth. So that was sort of something that was done a few days ago, if I'm not wrong. So as you can see on March 22nd, this sort of very long YAML file was introduced, which follows the OpenAPI spec. And for the list-mong development server, so if you go through this, it's basically a YAML file, which sort of gives you all the paths or the routes. So for the /health endpoint, there is a get call that you can make, which is tagged as miscellaneous. This is the description. This is the response sort of bunch of such endpoints. And so you should ideally auto-generate this. Like, feels like something obvious, right? That you should auto-generate. You don't really want to write every route by hand in such a long file that looks so ugly. So there are ways to auto-generate the OpenAPI file. It's slightly easier in some languages, slightly harder in others. It is harder in Golang for a few reasons. And the way that I could find to so one thing I'm unsure of is whether or not this was sort of created by hand or it was sort of auto-generated. Assuming it was auto-generated, but from what I could understand from the issue that we were looking at originally, which is this latest issue right here, there were some issues in it. So I'm sort of not sure if this was auto-generated or not. Maybe it was. And so the issue is that there are some inconsistencies in it. And this user, the Stargazer33, they created like a Java client from the OpenAPI spec file, which sort of isn't working correctly because, well, it's not sending the right schema or like expecting a different response, so on and so forth. And hence, sort of the issue sort of becomes, how do you fix this spec file? Probably not by hand. If you're fixing it by hand, you'll definitely miss something out. So you probably want to auto-generate it. So the next step for me was, one, I want to know how this was generated. So that's the question I'm going to ask now. And secondly, how does this happen in Golang generally when you're creating an HTTP server? So I sort of went through their HTTP server and they use something called Echo. If I go to init.go here, this is something I've sort of explored over the past few hours. The HTTP server that they're creating is using a library called Echo in Golang, which is, well, a high performance Go memoristic web framework. So it lets you create HTTP routes and even serve HTML. So now the next question for me was, how can I create an OpenAPI file given an HTTP server in Golang written in Echo? So Echo is the web framework that they use to create the HTTP server. And when I was scrolling through this repo, I saw a few things here. It says automatically generate RESTful API documentation with the OpenAPI client and server code generation, which is great. Automatically generate RESTful API documentation with Swagger 2.0. So this Echo Swagger sort of piqued interest. Feels like what we need. We need to create RESTful API documentation with Swagger, which sort of is what is used or like called OpenAPI today. So I went through this project. It gave me the steps to generate the OpenAPI file. The only thing I have to keep in mind is I have to write comments on top of all the routes, or generally through the code, I need to make sure I write comments in a few places. And those comments are what will be converted to the OpenAPI spec file. So it still cannot automatically generate the file for me. What do I mean by automatically? Well, your code sort of has like all these endpoints exposed, right? If I go through this code base of listmonk, and if I search for init handlers, I think something like that. Yeah. If I search for init handlers, so I go to this function is sort of what creates all the get, post, put endpoints. Basically, this sort of defines your schema of HTTP calls, the route that needs to be hit and how it needs to get handled. If I go to this sort of handle function, it will give me the inputs, the outputs. So as you can see, there's a param called lang that will be an input, and the output that it will return will sort of be a raw message, and like figuring out the raw message from here, things like these. And sort of the process of figuring out the inputs and the output and putting them in a spec file cannot be done automatically in Golang is what I could understand. I could be wrong. But from a quick Google search, I realized that there's no easy way to automatically create the OpenAPI spec unless you put comments like these throughout your code base. So if you're using the Echo Swagger project, you'll have to put such comments. This is like one big comment above the main function, but every time you're creating a route, you will have to sort of create a comment that describes what this route does. I'll quickly show you how I did it here. If I go to the bounce.go file, which exposes this route, the handle get subscriber bounces. If I search for this, you'll see this function is called here on a get request to /API/subscribers. Basically this file, the handlers.go file, which had this init HTTP handlers function, has these bunch of handlers. I will have to, for each of these handlers, write a bunch of comments above which describe what this HTTP endpoint does. And then this will automatically get generated into an OpenAPI spec file. So this is a good way to automatically generate the file that we're looking for. Now I need to check. This would have been a good PR. I could have at this point created all of these and sort of created a pull request that actually had these in the code. And that way, anytime a new endpoint is introduced or any change is made, You just need to make the same change here in the comment, and your spec file will automatically change. This is much better than sort of making changes directly in the spec file by hand. So if I have this very long spec file, where to go? So the very long spec file that we have, if I change a route here, this is the /subscribers/id route, let's say this one. Going to this file, finding it and changing it here is sort of hard, but making the change here in the comment is easy. Whenever you're changing the code, make sure you make a change in the comment as well, and then you automatically generate the OpenAPI spec file. So this is the gist of where I reached. Now I could have, for every route that they have, sort of quickly created these endpoints and created a pull request, but I didn't do that. Why? Because one, someone is already working on it. The whole process of generating this OpenAPI spec was written by someone in the last 1 week or so. So if I go to the recent comments, a lot of this Swagger introduction has been done recently. And I did not want to step over someone else's toes. If someone else is doing the change, you shouldn't do that. But I did find like an automatic way to do it. And up until this point, from what I can tell, there are no automatic OpenAPI spec generation that's happening. I could be wrong, which is why I first need to ask the person who's working on it, hey, how are you generating the file? Just out of curiosity. I was going through, let me just create the comment and then let's go through it together. So here is what I wrote. Hi, I was going through the changes that introduced the API spec. Out of curiosity, I wanted to understand how the file was generated. Was it auto-generated somehow? From my very limited knowledge in Golang, there is no easy way to auto-generate the spec without adding documentation throughout the project. I referred the project that I just took you guys through, this one, and this sort of expects you to put documentation on top of every route and on top of the main file. Would it make sense to introduce something like this through the code base so that the file is auto-generated? There would still be scope for error since the file isn't automatically generated from the code, which I just explained a while back. You can't really generate it directly from the code. You have to write comments, and there is a very high possibility that what the route expects and what you're putting here are different things, and hence there is still some possibility for error, but it would make it slightly easier to track and make changes versus making them directly in the spec file. So this is the comment that I wrote. What I could have done, I could have created a pull request already, made all the changes, and a lot of that could be wasted effort. Maybe the person who made the original change is generating this automatically somehow, in which case it doesn't make sense for me to sort of create the pull request and go through a bunch of effort trying to create these for all the routes. And hence, always a good idea to check very politely what is happening. Does this other thing make sense? If it makes sense, maybe hand it off to the other person who's working on it. And then if they ask you to do it, then feel free to do it. But it's like a nice humble way to sort of get into a repo versus on day zero, like aggressively creating pull requests. This was sort of one of the reasons that I wanted to make this pull request to show you guys. A lot of this comes from feedback from maintainers of projects that I've sort of open sourced or contributed to on my YouTube channel. Don't contribute on day zero. Slowly, steadily get there. And more importantly, focus on sharpening your axe. For example, in this case, makes sense for me to I learned a lot of things. I came to know about one, the HTTP framework in Go that these guys are using, which is Echo. 2, how you can generate OpenAPI specs. 3, in Golang, there's no easy way for you to automatically generate it unless you write comments through your file. In some other languages, you can automatically generate it even without writing comments. So this was like a decent learning for me. Again, Zerodha, as I said, they don't have a very conventional hiring path. So don't keep that as a motivation. Don't aggressively start posting. I feel like I'm repeating myself at this point. But you get the idea. And from now on, let's focus a little bit on sharpening the axe and actually understanding your fundamentals, making them clear. Like it took me some time to sort of understand this code base, but I understand this fairly well now. Let's try to reach a stage where everyone who's on this channel or a lot of people can at least understand code bases. Whether or not you want to contribute is a different story. Whether or not you get hired is a different story, but at least you have the skills to contribute, and then you can decide whether or not you want to contribute to one repo or create your own project, so on and so forth. That is the gist of my advice. With that, let's end the video. I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.